going to start our lecture on family systems now, or the context of development. So just an overview. This lecture is about the individual as part of a system. Each person exists not just as an individual, but as part of a larger system. We can't look at child development without looking at the role of the family, the culture, the time period, etc. There's a lot in this topic. In fact, I took a whole semester-long course in it. So this lecture is going to take a while, but we're going to cover the following concepts. Okay? We're going to talk about parenting and how that influences child development, siblings and birth order, traditions and routines, and the effects of culture. Essentially, a child does not develop in a vacuum. Their development is heavily influenced by their family, their neighborhood, their SES. SES stands for socioeconomic status. It's a combination of neighborhood that they live in, salary, education level, etc. This is not a parenting course, so I'll only be presenting a little of the research on how parenting and family factors affect development. If you want, I can give you some handouts or information on parenting, or if you want them directly, I can email them to you. None of it would be required reading, it would all be for your information. So if you want that, just let me know. So let's start with the context of development. Again, development doesn't happen in a vacuum. This means that children don't develop the same way in all situations. It happens within the context of the child's life. So I'm going to throw some terms at you that may seem a little intimidating, but they do make sense if you're just patient with them. Normative age-graded influences. These are developmentally relevant influences determined by biology and the environment, such as the beginning of school, potty training, puberty, etc. These are things that happen at a normal time. Normative means normal. Age-graded means it's based on age. Children tend to start school at the same time, potty train around the same time, start puberty around the same time. It's based on age. Normative sociocultural graded influences. These are developmental influences related to the ecological niche. Like I said, SES, socioeconomic status, is a big one here. So if someone lives in poverty, it might mean that they have poor air quality, live in a dangerous neighborhood, have low parental involvement, etc. So their culture, their SES, matters on how they develop. Low and high SES both have negative outcomes when compared to middle SES. So you can think of this instead as class, working class, middle class, upper class. We tend to see the best outcomes in middle class, but we'll talk more about those later. History-graded influences. These are biological and environmental developmental influences that are related to a unique historical period. So this might be if there's a war going on, economic depression, September 11th, global pandemic. All those things are history-graded influences that change child development. And then we get to non-normative influences. These are atypical influences that don't happen to most children. So maybe a child whose parent died or has an abusive family life. They're not all negative. Maybe winning the lottery, that's a non-normative influence. So all of these things have different effects on development that you have to consider. Next, we're going to talk about the concept of feedback. So when talking about systems, there are some certain terms you need to be familiar with, and I'll talk about feedback a lot. So the first idea is that of homeostasis. So homeostasis refers to a state of balance. When something happens to throw things out of balance, we usually do whatever it takes to return to that state of balance, even if that state is unhealthy for us. It's just a psychological term. We, as humans, want to go back to what is normal to us, what is our homeostasis. So when I use the term feedback in this course, what I'm referring to is this idea of homeostasis and whether or not we're returning to it or moving away from it. So this is another instance where the terminology we use in everyday life is different than the terminology we're going to use here. So first off, negative feedback. This means something that pushes back toward homeostasis. It does not mean bad feedback. It's again a mathematical term. It fights against change. It subtracts change. The easiest example of negative feedback is a thermostat. You set it to a certain temperature, it's homeostasis. If it gets too cold, the heater turns on, bringing the temperature back to homeostasis. If it gets too hot, the heater turns off. Okay, so this is negative feedback. It's constantly subtracting change to return you to your state of balance. Well, the opposite of this is positive feedback. So if negative feedback meant subtracting from change, positive feedback means adding to it. It means a consistent increase or decrease to behavior, and it moves you away from homeostasis. It adds to the change. If this happens enough, it pushes you far enough away, a new homeostasis may form. So an example of a positive feedback loop might be the idea of climate change. We get greenhouse gases in the environment. It heats up the water, which releases more water vapor, which increases the greenhouse effect, and it can go on and on like that. It's a positive feedback. This is one of the most difficult concepts to understand in this class, so I have a diagram that I hope will help you. So over here we have homeostasis. You encounter an event that moves you away from your homeostasis. You can either have positive feedback that increases the change and moves you farther away, or you can have negative feedback that resists change and moves you back toward homeostasis. So let's say homeostasis is a parent and a child who are getting along. Well, something happens, this event, and makes the parent and child start to fight. Something happens and makes the kid lose their temper. Okay, now the parent can react in one of two ways. If the parent yells back at the kid, making the kid more angrier, who yells back at mom, and both parent and mom, get more and more upset, that's positive feedback. They're moving further away from that calm state. But if a kid gets angry and loses their temper at mom, and mom is calm and helps the child calm down, and helps the child return back to that state of homeostasis, the state of calm, balance, then that's negative feedback. I hope that makes sense to you, because when I talk about positive and negative feedback in this class, this is what I'm referring to. So if you have any questions about this, please let me know. Next, we're going to talk about ecological systems theory. You may have studied this before. This was from Bronfenbrenner. He was a Russian-born American psychologist. His work in the 1960s and 1970s helped in the formation of the Head Start program, which is a preschool program. So his theory was key in changing the perspective of developmental psychology by calling attention to the large number of environmental and societal influences on child development. Remember, at this time, behaviorism was king, so he was drawing attention to things other than the direct punishment and reinforcement. His theory was that child development is not just about the child, but rather the larger system in which the child developed. And I'll have a diagram for you to show that later. It has multiple circles of influence with the individual at the center. So the microsystem is the immediate setting within which the child operates. So this might be the household or a classroom, a daycare. It's an immediate setting in which the child is present. So there are subsystems within each microsystem. So if you look at the microsystem of the family, there might be the marital relationship, sibling relationships, interaction between the parent and child, etc. Those are all subsystems. An infant has a very limited number of microsystems. They might just have home and daycare. But as children get older, they get more and more microsystems. So now they might have school, peers, the neighborhood, after-school programs, a sports team. As we get older, we get more and more microsystems. Next is the mesosystem. This includes interactions between microsystems. So if you have the microsystem of the family and the microsystem of your classroom, a parent-teacher conference is where those two microsystems come together. That would be called a mesosystem. So it might also be a family involvement at church, making the family microsystem and the church microsystem interact with each other. So the lack of mesosystems, which you can also think of as a support network, can have negative effects on children. You want their microsystems to be able to interact and support each other. That's why it's called a support system. The next level is the exosystem. This includes a member of the child's microsystem, such as a parent, and an outside organization, such as the parent's workplace. But it doesn't include the child directly. Exo means outside, so this is outside of the child. However, the exosystems have an indirect influence on the child. For example, the parent experiences stress at work. The child's not there, they don't see the workplace, they don't see the stress at work. But when the parent comes home, maybe because they're so stressed, they have less patience with the child and act in a different way. And that way, the parent's workplace has influenced the child, even though the child never experienced it directly. Therefore, it's called an exosystem. The next level out is the macro system. This is the cultural values and attitudes of the family's social environment. It's the culture at large. It's the values of the culture, the traditions, maybe religion. These are the things that go on in the culture. Think about how the values of one culture can be drastically different than the values of another culture. And those values can change how a child is raised. So all of these systems influence the development of a child, and they affect each other. So, for example, we're looking at a teenager with anorexia. We can't just treat the teenager. We have to see what's going on in the family, which is the microsystem, the peers, another microsystem, and maybe the influence of the media, which is a macrosystem. You have to consider all of these things. You can't just treat the child by herself. Bronfenbrenner later accounted for the influence of time, such as specific events and changes in the culture over time, by adding chronosystem to his theory. So this is the influence of the particular time period. So think, is child development different now with all the technology that we have than it was for your grandparents? What about children growing up during a time of war or famine? We have to consider the time period. And here's a good diagram to show Bronfenbrenner's theory. So you can see at the middle we have the individual and all the characteristics of that individual. Then we have the microsystems, family, school, peers, neighborhood, things in which the child interacts directly. Out here we have the mesosystem, so it's how all those microsystems interact with each other. Here's the exosystem, friends and family, mass media, social welfare services, legal services, neighbors, things outside the child but still influence the child. Then we get to the macro system, which is the attitudes and ideologies of the culture. And down here we have the chronosystem. So you can see all of these systems are embedded within one another, and you have all of these arrows. These arrows indicate that each of these systems influences all of the other systems. So in Bronfenbrenner's theory, we really can't isolate anything. In order to understand a child, you have to understand all of these systems that surround that child. In the next video, we're going to talk about the parent-child relationship.